Good morning, everybody. Yeah, so my name is Matt Owen. I'm pre-sales manager here at GroupBC, and I'm joined here by two fantastic speakers with a great wealth and breadth of combined experience. So I'm here with Martin Townsend, who's an independent consultant, a good friend of ours, who has a really fantastic resume, really, with highlights of Environment Agency, DEFRA, BRE. And I'm also joined by Michael Barber, who we've known for over 5 years now, formerly with one of our major clients at Sainsbury's, and now with one of our key project delivery partners at Concentre Consulting. And I'm sure they'll introduce themselves a little more so when they talk. But thank you, gents, for joining me. So a little bit on the agenda. We're going to be, like I say, here for the next hour. This is really aimed at owner-operators clients and public sector clients, and we're going to be talking about digital market transformation. I'll be speaking briefly about project information management and why it's important to curate and validate that information. Mike Barber is going to talk about asset information management and making digital business as usual and driving adoption. And as I said, hopefully we'll have a little time at the end for some questions as well. So before I hand over to Martin, I wanted to just give you a little background and briefly introduce GroupBC, who we are, what we do. So we've been helping owner-operators as well as project delivery teams really over the last 20 years to collaborate and manage projects and asset information. And more recently, we've seen a real step change in the owner-operator client base who are becoming more and more focused on digital transformation, protecting their assets with by digitizing in the long term. And clients like Heathrow, HS2, Highways England are really driving their digital estate agenda. So we wanted to hold this webinar to look at trends in the industry, why clients are taking more ownership of data, and hopefully drive that digital agenda forward. So for now, enough from me. I'm going to hand over to our first presenter, Martin Townsend. So let me give him control. Over to you, Martin. Thank you.
Right. Good morning, even actually. Thank you, Matt, for the introduction. No pressure in terms of actually coming to this webinar with a wealth of experience, but as Matt has said, I've worked in all different parts of the public sector. In fact, most of my life has been working in a public sector, either from a policy perspective at DEFRA or at some of the sharp end at the Environment Agency. So I feel very comfortable and very honoured to come and actually sort of talk to you about my view in terms of where this digital transformation is going. I've got 15 minutes to kind of unpack and then repack all that's going on in this space. So I'm going to make no apologies on the basis that it's going to be quite pacey in terms of the conversation. So let me start. So I've broken my presentation down into 5 bite-sized chunks, basically. I want to talk about the drivers. I want to talk about what is this digital transformation, what are the advantages, and what are the opportunities. So those are the kind of areas I want to really talk about. For me, if we don't have enough time, or if I don't sort of fulfill all of the issues that you want to talk about, there is plenty of time for questions at the end. And in that, we've got an opportunity to kind of sort of, all the experts can sort of answer any questions you have. Equally, almost see us, the speakers, as your support team to try and navigate through this conversation about what's going on in this digital space and what you can do to help your own organizations improve. When Stuart, who's one of the directors here at GroupBC, asked me to present, he said, really challenge the listeners in terms of what's going on. So I thought where I would start is with a big statement. And fortunately for me, the Financial Times gave me that big statement on Sunday, which is very much around, some of the issues we're seeing in terms of urban change and the pressures that places then on the public sector, the private sector, the environment, society as a whole, is really starting us to understand and challenge ourselves in terms of what do we need to do differently. And the quote then goes on to say, and I think importantly goes on to say, that those organizations that embrace the digital agenda, that embraces change, will actually succeed and actually prosper as a result. And I think that is so important, that it is about doing something. There was a presentation I attended recently where a consultant said that in large organizations there's a good chance that many people will just sit and wait and wonder what to do. The best thing to do in terms of trying to actually ensure that you are digitally enabling your organization is to do something. And just to kind of, and this is one of my quick slides, to almost give you confidence that what we're seeing around digital construction and change in the industry as a whole is nothing new. We've seen massive changes over centuries in terms of industrial revolutions, change in terms of concepts, and change in the way industries work. So take comfort that although if you're at the sharp end or you're in an organization trying to be the champion of all this change, that actually you basically are among many people who've kind of driven change over the centuries. So let me just keep with this bird's eye view of what's going on, and talk about some of the big picture stuff in terms of the drivers. So if regardless of which industry you're coming from on this webinar and where you're listening from, we need to actually make sure that we are continue to improve and continue to transform our industry. Part of that is about whether our industries need to be self-regulated or need to be regulated by government. And in the conversation around digitization and BIM, there have been some great interventions from the government through various strategies and policies to drive this change. But the industries, I think, need to be really quite aware of whether they want to self-regulate and drive performance, or whether they're looking for others to drive that debate. But actually, regardless of that, we do need an industry that is transforming, is adopting technology quicker in all its various forms. And as that previous slide suggested, we need to do that in a way that makes sure that we improve the margins, the costs of what we're doing in terms of construction refurbishment are lower, and coupled with that, or actually sort of almost uncoupling, I suppose, is that construction process, the impact has a lower impact on society. So where that comes from, I suppose, is that the industry, or the construction industry in particular, is incredibly disjointed. When you look at how it performs to date, it has been very much working in silos. And a great piece of research, and this isn't an ink blot test where I'm testing you how you feel on a Wednesday morning. This is a piece of research that comes from UCL quite recently, which looks at a number of industries and sees how joined up or disjointed they are. And it won't actually come as much as a surprise to you that the construction industry, which is the one in the middle, is the most disjointed industry, because we're not sharing and we're not actually communicating as widely as we need to when it comes to sharing data and sharing information. And in essence, when we're talking about a digital agenda and changing and sharing information and collaborating, what we're trying to do is correct that diagram in the middle. And the essence of that, to some extent, is this diagram you see on the screen, that historically there have been an incredible amount of professionals talking and creating noise in a construction project or in a refurbishment project. But actually they tend to be just conversations between individuals. What we need to try and do to enable new ideas and sharing and collaboration is we need to make sure that we have a common data environment, a common data model that sits at the heart of what we do, to allow those conversations to be much more effective, and to make sure they're more efficient, that we're sharing that information in a way that we know it's the latest information and it's effective. So if I kind of go back to my drivers for change slide, we need to make sure those innovation cycles and those enablers are really happening as quickly as possible. And with that, making sure that the cost of construction and new business opportunities really do come to the surface. the other point which I kind of wanted to kind of just dwell on for a second, I suppose, was the issue that to date, and I'm being slightly controversial just to kind of get you all to think a little. Much of these conversations have actually been driven by individuals. Where we need to get to in terms of digital transformation is we need to make sure that we are allowing everybody in the organization to be part of this conversation. And that is so important, because this whole idea about finding the benefits from a digital perspective is about enabling everybody to become part of that process. I think a couple of good examples just to reinforce that slide is, if you think about health and safety on a construction site, many years ago it was the responsibility of an individual. You go onto a construction site now, everybody is responsible for health and safety. We need to see exactly that same type of transformation when we talk about the digital agenda. I'm going to give you another example as well, which is slightly different, but hopefully looking at some of the delegates who are attending, it might resonate with some of them. I'm working with a local authority at the moment that are truly embracing this digital agenda, and they are looking to try and apply blockchain to the planning process. They're at the early stages of it, but their logic at the moment is, if we have a digital core strategy which shows where development is taking place, how it is going to be enabled, etc., etc., when developers come forward with their plan permissions, they need to present them digitally. That includes their plans, that includes how they are going to deliver that development. It also enables the local community to look and understand how that transformation will take place in their community. And then when the development's taking place, there is an opportunity to check what was proposed and what is actually being developed and delivered. And I think that is such an important issue in terms of making sure that everybody is part of this conversation. But equally, the performance gap between design and operation and what is delivered on the ground, I think, is a big, big issue. It's something which has come out of the Hackett Review. It's something that's come out of various government reports, that sometimes we're very good at talking about delivering one thing and delivering something else. Now comes the sort of almost iconic diagram that I think every presentation that I've ever seen which mentions BIM has to include. I think it was originally drawn or presented by Mark Bew, who's a collaborator with GroupBC, so a friend of many of the people here. And in essence, what we're talking about is how do we make sure that we are really enabling the design, the collaboration, the integration across all of those design teams to make the most of what's going on. The genesis of this really comes back to the construction strategy in 2011, when government was challenging the industry around existing business models, practices, and also the slightly adversarial culture that sits within the industry. How do we actually bridge that and make it much more of a collaborative one? And I think where we are today, there's a clear demonstration, and it goes back to this, do we want an industry that's self-regulated, or do we want one that's regulated by government? It's a clear demonstration that the industry is collaborating so much more than it ever has before. And that is actually providing benefits in terms of cost reduction, innovation, supporting supply chains in terms of making sure that we are seeing efficiencies there. And I think that diagram in its own right, and the interventions made both in the 2011 construction strategy, but also in the sort of the further reinforced by government subsequently, is demonstrating that the industry is moving now. And if you look at a league table of where adoption of BIM and how it's playing a role in most countries across the world, the UK sits proudly at the top of that table. And that's so important in terms of export opportunities, in terms of making the most of data, making sure that we are really leading the way and continue to lead the way. So mindful that my time is running away quite quickly. This slide here really kind of almost summarizes where we are in terms of what I've been talking about, that we really need to make sure that we are embracing this change, and sitting with the kind of the challenge that I was given, that to get you thinking before more detailed kind of conversations are going to be presented by the following kind of presenters. What are those examples of things that we can see differently? So I kind of was thinking this morning that if you look at the way the construction industry works, or the way your businesses work, and the example that I gave you around a local authority using blockchain to make their digital city come alive and to make sure it was an enabler, there's some examples there where 5-10 years ago you would have never thought that the largest movie house has no cinemas, that the largest taxi company has no taxis. And we need to say to ourselves, we need to challenge ourselves as an industry. If we're going to improve, what are the business models? What are the opportunities of using data much more effectively? How do we make sure that we not only actually think about our processes and think about the way we transform, is we also need to think about how that kind of impacts on our customers. And just to kind of summarize there some of the advantages as well. I've mentioned most of them already, but it's always worthwhile just reinforcing them. It is about making sure that stakeholders understand about the asset that's being commissioned. I've mentioned already in this conversation about the Hackett review, performance gap. That is going to become so much more important. It's about ensuring that we reduce costs, project duration, improve the value. There's some really great examples now when we're starting to look at modern methods of construction and modular design. The REBA stages are really condensed in terms of the way projects can be delivered. And when they are delivered, the snagging that results is incredibly small compared to what you would call a typical construction project today. Centre to this, and in much of the media today, is how do we make sure that we minimise our carbon footprint? How do we collaborate more? How do we make sure that we're building better, higher quality projects, and those outcomes are what the client needs? And centre to all of that is a digital agenda. There are a lot of resources available, but there's a couple I just want to kind of point you to. Downloadable from the GroupBC website is a great publication on public sector transformation. I'm more than happy, as I said, to pick up any questions at the end of this webinar, but never afraid to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want to. Always happy to ask questions for like-minded souls that want to make a difference. And on that, I think I'll pass back to Matt.
Great, thank you for that, Martin. That was great, and that slide a few slides back with Uber and relating to Uber and Netflix, I thought was really interesting and food for thought. And it is quite exciting to be in the UK at the moment, with PAS 1192 turning into the ISO 19650, and really seems like we're in quite an innovative period, especially in the UK. So I'll spend a bit of time. I wanted to speak to you briefly for the next 10 minutes, really, about project information management, and as a client, why it's important to be involved in this process of defining, creating, and validating that information that's generated. So before I really get into it, I want to just define really what I mean by project information management. And firstly, I'm really talking a very broad term about the collection, management, and distribution of both graphical, so drawings and models, and non-graphical information. So anything really that's generated throughout the design and build process. And you've likely heard the abbreviation. This is a fairly busy slide, but it should make sense. You've heard the abbreviation PIM, which can also stand for Project Information Model, which is the virtual construction model and all the associated information that develops throughout design and construction eventually becomes the asset information model. And what I'm talking about here is the curation of all of that information, all that documentation that's being generated from the supply chain and gets approved. So why should a public sector owner operator really care about project information management and not just be concerned with the receipt of an asset information model towards the end of a project? Well, let's consider what you typically receive at handover. So traditionally, so you might receive a model, drawings, specs, manuals, certificates, etc. And whilst these give us a good a level of information, amount of usable information about the operation of the asset, we lose a significant amount of information about the construction and any key design decisions, construction decisions that were made along the way. And this information is essential, really, for future maintenance, for future projects, from a litigation perspective. And if we consider, if from a litigation perspective, if something were to go wrong further down the line, in this case, the walkie-talkie building, I don't know if you remember, was reflecting and melting pavements and melting people's Jags wing mirrors, and more recently, the tragic fire at Grenfell has really highlighted that we need to make sure we have available construction records and, importantly, decisions to hand. And it's not just from a litigation perspective. Upcoming refurb projects, for example, would benefit massively from having those construction records, previous surveys, reports, etc. available. So I'll almost apologise for my next slide. It's testament to my design skill. This is the level of my design flair. But I want to highlight, oftentimes what I see typically happen on a project is as a client, you get invited to a contractor's common data environment. You're given a client area where you're drip fed information, and as an operator, the success really of a BIM level 2 project is predicated on the information requirements that you have in order to successfully operate the asset. So this means whilst you're outsourcing the design and build process, you need to be able to control and check the information that's coming in, and you're not kind of just kept on the outskirts of all of that toing and froing during design and build. So as a client, what is a good level of engagement, and what's the right balance between being involved and helping shape the flow of that information without stifling the project team's expertise and being overbearing? So overall, you need to make sure that you define your requirements and exactly what information you need to operate and maintain the asset. And then you need to effectively manage the delivery of the information on a continual basis. So I'm going to do a similar thing to Martin and show up a very popular slide that we've probably seen. It's almost a BIM bingo type affair. So this you've likely seen this. This is the project information lifecycle diagram that you may have seen if you've read the PAS 2 documents. So what you really need critically to start off with is and a lot of people know this. This is almost BIM 101, but I still see either these not appearing with clients or being quite generic. And what you really need is a good quality, comprehensive employees information requirements document, spelling out what information is required, in what format, when it's required, and it would help if you say why, to give a bit of context and help the project team structure. And by creating a good quality EIR, you kickstart a process to get you off to a fantastic start to the project. So you define your EIR, that gives you an asset information model deliverable, gives the teams a goal. They will produce for you a BIM execution plan, possibly master information delivery plans, defining when information should arrive and by whom. And secondly, once you've got all that in place, going back to my previous point about being drip-fed information from within a contractor's CDE, you need a way of receiving project information and validating that information. Now, of course, on a project, a contractor's probably going to withhold information, often because it genuinely isn't relevant to you and not because they're trying to hide corners that they're cutting. But what's really important that as the client, you use your CDE to receive information and correspond and approve information, etc., and structure all of that unmanaged information. I've seen without this, I've seen a lot of client-contractor relationships suffer at the end of the project when it comes to handover, where either not enough information is handed over or there's a mass dump of unstructured information at the end of a project. And it's really important that that going forward we build this information up and improve it throughout the course of the project, really. So if we go back to the slide I showed earlier, it's becoming more and more common let me just go over that. It's becoming more and more common for project teams to use multiple CDs on a project. That's not a problem. The contractor will likely use something. They might be receiving information from other consultants' CDs. That's not something to be afraid of. It kind of goes without saying, but with an EIR, CD, and all the other good stuff in place, you obviously need a team in place to help manage that process. And I know that Mike will be talking about this a little later. In my experience, having a few key employees who are able to administer, train others on how to use a CDE, as well as control information coming in, is essential. But my overarching point here is it's very easy to defer to a contractor and their processes, and the relationship should be good, but it's easy to passively receive information towards the end of a project. However, the benefit of continuous management of information by the client will absolutely result in a much better quality information, quality asset information model upon completion, which brings me hopefully to my next speaker, and hopefully that made sense. I'm going to pass you over to Michael Barber now. If I give him control. Hopefully, Mike, you can hear me.
I can. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes taking you through, introducing myself and who I am. Then we'll look at the asset information and management side and look at AIM, and then we'll spend some time talking about how, as a information consultant, do we approach digital transformation and how we support our clients. So a bit about me. My name is Michael Barber. I work for a information consultant called Concentre Consulting. Before that, for the last 14 years, I worked at Sainsbury's within the property division as a systems and information development manager. And I spent the last 5 years leading their digital estate program. And the aim of that program was to enable colleagues and partners to answer questions, gain insight, and find information quickly, accurately, and completely through better management and continued development of their information and systems. So what did that actually deliver? It was a 5-year program broken down into people, process, technology. And we touched over the end of the program will touch over 3,000 users. We trained over 500 people. There was 170 companies involved, and there was a whole self-serve training package delivered. From a process point of view, it interacted and migrated 2.5 million documents into our core system suite, 27.5 million data records, all underpinned by core standards aligned with 1192, and there were 6 key standards that underpinned that. And then as part of protecting and maintaining it, 17 audits were put in place. And then from a technology point of view, as part of the system-wide review, 5 systems were decommissioned, 2 systems were introduced, 15 spreadsheets were decommissioned, and then there were 11 integrations that happened, because we got to a point where actually there's not a single solution. This is part of an integrated solution. So let's have a look at Concentre Consulting. So originally formed in 2016 by James Eaton and based in London. Over the last 4 years, have become one of the leading information consultants out there, and have recently become part of HPF Group and also HDR, which has enabled us to expand on a global scale. And this is just an overview of high-level stats. So we manage 5 common data environments across lots of different platforms, look after 150 projects worldwide. We have our own e-learning platform, and you'll notice as we go through this, the big piece to any kind of change program is all about adoption, and people are key to that. 3,000 containers managed per month and over 200 organizations. So let's look at some of the detail around information or asset information management. So the challenge. So ultimately you've got designers that are creating their work in progress, and as per Matt showed you on his slide before, they're sending that to the contractor's PIM CDE, and as part of this, we then want people sending it to the client's PIM, and then ultimately the client has their own aim, which gives them the construction record of what was built. So why is that important? To ultimately improve the ability to find information, to answer questions, and to gain insight about your own estate. And one of the key drivers over the last 5 years were them, what should be really simple things, to answer them questions like, what have we got, where have we got it, how is it utilised, and are we maximising our own estate? Where does the client CDE sit? And this particular example, they broke it down into 3 sections. So they develop the estate and they have different asset types. They have a system that manages their specs and standards. They have a system that manages their project and programs. They manage the estate, so the existing portfolio, and they had multiple portfolio types and over 4,000 assets, and also a third-party support. And then from maintaining the estate, you had the FM side with a third-party support. You had a remote monitoring with third-party support, and then you had a change program that was broken up into CapEx change and OpEx change. And in the center of that sits the CDE. And the CDE, in most simplistic terms, was a filing cabinet, a process manager, a database, and a photography. And its ultimate aim was to support in decision making. All layered up with security, so people only see the things they need access to, and underpinned by an accountability framework, quality control, and data governance to make sure that you have confidence in the credibility of the information. So let's look at the detail on how we broke that down and how we ultimately delivered it. So we've touched on the kind of the 3 pillars around develop your estate, manage your estate, and maintain your estate. But the most important one before you start is really understanding your estate and getting back to them plain language questions around what are the things that you need to know to enable you to deliver them 3 things. And all of that is broken down by people, process, technology, which aids in that digital transformation. And the way that we approach this is by breaking down a roadmap to achieve that digital transformation. So this is a really high level example of how to deliver a CDE. So again, people, process, technology, looking at the high level communication that needs to happen around what's coming, why, and getting people to a point where they know what's coming, and most importantly, what's in it for them and why should they care. Looking at how do we roll out naming conventions, project plans, and all the standards that are going to underpin this to make sure that when you look at integration, it's easy to integrate systems. Impact review of change. So delivering any change to a business is a challenge, and people are the hardest bit. People do not like change. And how do you take them on that journey? And then from a technology point of view, reviewing your existing systems, looking at how do you hold your national database of properties, and then what is the right CDE vendor to deliver them requirements. And then once you've done that, it goes into the next level around delivering the rollout of standards, reviewing what's your access model, your information structure, your workflow, any UX requirements, and how do you make that a simple journey to find the information or to answer the questions. Looking at, do you need to procure any databases, or is what you've currently got fit for purpose? And the same with the CDE, do you need to procure and set one up, or have you got one that just needs to be refreshed? And then moving into the people side again, how do you land that CDE? How do you launch some kind of learning portal to make sure that people understand why should they care, and ultimately what's in it for them? Getting from a process point of view, looking at your BAU processes, how you're going to protect and maintain, how you're going to support, audit, review, and improve, and that constant drive for improvement in your information, utilising the systems and everything that you've put in place. How do you integrate, and then ultimately, how do you migrate? So you're going to have lots and lots of information across the business that's been gathering over time, and ultimately is really important. But how do you bring that together, or how do you bring in information that may have been siloed with your third parties into your core systems? Because at the moment there is a challenge that as asset owners we heavily rely on third parties to support. And then once you've got your high level roadmap, breaking that down to the level underneath, around, okay, what are all of the opportunities? And as you start to look at this change program, there will be loads and loads of opportunities identified. And you need to plot them, you need to measure them based on ease of delivery and benefit. And ultimately, we're after anything that's in the green section and try and stay away from some of the bits in the red. And understanding any dependencies, there may be some things that actually are quite difficult to implement and not a massive benefit, but to really maximize and achieve some of the big ticket items later on, we need to deliver some of the dependencies. Define your priorities and then justify tangible deliverables. So ultimately, we need to make sure that whatever's delivered has tangible benefits and that we can quantify them. So how do we approach that on our side? So we start with the people, the technology, and the process from a digital transformation, and looking at, and right at the heart of that is people, and I've mentioned it a couple of times. Any change program, you need to make sure that the people understand why you're doing it, what are you trying to achieve, and that they really buy into it. And if they don't, then getting them to a point where they understand why the business is doing it. And then balancing the approach. So you'll always get to the point where you have your, you've got your client requirements, what are you trying to achieve? That following the above, you've gone through and you've defined your roadmap, you've defined kind of the detail that sits underneath it, you understand what you achieve. You've, through your requirements, looked at it and used a technique like Moscow around what are my musts, what are my shoulds, what are my coulds, and what are my won'ts. And then defining, okay, based on this is what we want to achieve as a client, what are the industry standards and how do they align with our existing processes? What is our technology solution? So whether it's an existing solution or you've gone out and looked at a new solution, how do we balance the three? All technologies have limitations. The standards are ultimately a guide, but we want to align them as much as possible. It will make it easier swapping things about, and we want to align with the industry and the learnings that everyone's gone through. But we ultimately need to deliver the client requirements. So there's a balance between the three. And then this is how we would approach it. So we break it down into defining and understanding what we need to do. Discover, really get to the heart of what's the challenge, what we're trying to achieve, understanding the as is, what the barriers, what the opportunities, what's the benefit, and creating an outline plan. Looking at design. So now we've, as part of Discovered, picked the right technology. We've looked at the internal processes and we understand what needs to change. Now let's start to really design it and get to the detail around protocols, process, governance, program, etc. And then look at how do you deliver that and what's the implementation, what's the kind of the output, keeping that end in mind around what is it we're trying to achieve. Document controls, data validations, etc. So you get to the point where you have that tangible output at the end, which helps drive your business forward. And then going into the world of BAU, how do you review and audit? How do you align and agree? And how do you continue to update, going around in a circle? And ultimately, we see this as a collaboration. So working closely with our clients to look at how do we define together, discover, design, deliver, etc. And then into BAU, and whether that's a we support in maintaining, or whether that's a we take it and do it for you, or we hand over. And to be honest, that's me, which I've got through in a lot quicker than I thought I would. But hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of the importance of a client CDE. And same as Martin, I'm more than happy if there's any questions or any support, feel free to reach out and can help where we can. And Matt,
thanks, Mike.
Back to you.
Great, no, that was great, thank you, and appreciate it. So I think that's great. We've got plenty of time for some questions. I should have mentioned earlier, actually, you do have the ability to ask questions. You'll see in your little toolbar that you've got a questions panel you can pose some questions to us. But I think it's quite clear that we're seeing quite a significant change and culture shift in the way clients are trying to digitize their assets. And as Martin and Michael have been speaking, I've got a few questions that I think would be good to pose to them. So I think the first one, Martin, if I can go to you. I was really wondering. It's really an approach thing. What's the best way to digitize existing assets? Because obviously there's a lot of talk about information management throughout the life cycle of a project, but a significant portion of many of our owner operators out there are maintaining current assets and existing assets. So should we resurvey? Should point clouds using point cloud scans and retrospectively model, or should we be waiting for projects, new projects and refurbs to steadily build up that digital portfolio? And really, my sub question to that, or additional question, is: would the costs of that retrospective option outweigh the benefits? What's your view?
Wow, now that's a big question, isn't it? You've saved the big question. So actually, there's nothing worse than a really well-informed person asking the first tricky question. I'm going to sort of dodge it to some extent, because I think every client, and I think Michael covered this really well, every client needs to understand where they are on this journey. And I think from a public sector perspective, obviously there are a lot of assets that probably are not understood. I did a bit of work a while ago with some clients, and they couldn't even tell me what the floor area was of their buildings, let alone anything more sophisticated than that. And I suppose if we are looking at really bringing some of these historic assets into a more kind of digital format, there are some great technologies out there now in terms of point cloud surveys, but I think it's about starting and taking that journey slowly, but certainly, as I said before, doing something. And I honestly believe that bringing assets in and actually making sure you understand the basic parameters of them, is such an important issue. A while ago, I was working with Gatwick Airport, and they found that by actually making sure that they have a digital inventory, understanding where all the services were, was actually not kind of just a desirable thing. It was essential, because if they are refurbishing a gate at an airport, they need to do that in an incredibly short window. So their business parameters, their business needs were quick turnaround. They needed to know what pipe was behind what wall, what was its manufacture, what was its standard, so that when somebody went in at 2 o'clock in the morning, they weren't surprised, they weren't discovering things they didn't know about. Whereas for other clients, that may not be the case. The need to actually sort of have that level of detail might not be necessary. So I suppose I'm dodging the question to say, there is some great technology now that can bring some of our historic assets into a digital environment, but you do need to kind of understand, what you're trying to achieve from it. When you go through a refurbishment process, that is probably the right time to do it, because that really does then start to bring a business case in terms of making sure that legacy asset is really understood, and you're actually always improving it in an optimal way based on, the way it's constructed.
That was great. I don't think you dodged the question at all. I think that was a great answer. I'd be interested to hear from Mike on this as well. With Mike's historical experience, I think he said 14 years at Sainsbury's and digitizing their assets. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, to be honest, I would
retrospective digitization versus
I would,
a steady growth of information.
Yeah, I would echo what Martin said. So if I look at what I did at Sainsbury's, so based on Sainsbury's individual needs and what they were trying to achieve, and he went back to really defining them kind of plain language questions right at the start. As a business, what do we need to know to effectively manage, maintain and develop our estate? So going out and getting kind of full surveys and point clouds of everything, of the 3,500 assets that Sainsbury's owned, wasn't practical. but actually saying to effectively manage the business, we need to understand what equipment we've got, what's the size, what's the use, what properties do we own. So it was very much actually what are the data points that you need to enable you to deliver that, and based on that, that was the information they captured. So we went through and we touched every store, but from a really high level point to ensure we had the kind of the key things to enable us to make them decisions.
Okay, so this is and thanks for that, Mike. I think we talk about digitizing the asset and all and these quite complex processes, actually, almost blasé, you know, let's just do it, you know, but it as you both alluded to, really it's a massive cultural shift, you know, and that's arguably one of the biggest challenges. You know, the technology's there, we've got to now convince people to use it. So Mike, if I can ask you first, I think it really could go into both of you, really. But when it comes to the cultural shift, what's the best approach to changing the culture, of a large, maybe traditional organisation? Do we look at training everybody in en masse, in one big drive, or do we look at curating small evangelical groups, or do we almost use the stick right over the carrot and force change from management? What's your view?
So again, I think it ultimately depends on the organisation and their culture. The most important thing is getting the right leadership at the top and making sure they understand what are we doing, why are we doing it, what is it we're trying to achieve, and kind of breaking down that problem. And then, and I mentioned it quite a lot, it's all about people, and it's getting them to understand what's in it for them and why should they care, and communicate. It's one of the challenges I saw. There'll be certain things where people want to know everything and they want to get involved. There'll be others that just want to be told, okay, tell me what to do. And each company and organisation you work with are at different levels. Across the supply chain, you've got people that have absolutely embraced it and are running and pushing the agenda themselves. You have other consultants that I've worked with that are ultimately still dinosaurs, and that's the way they've always done it, and that's the way they want to work. So there's no one single approach that you can blanket say, actually, this is the way to do it, and everyone will fall in line, depending on what you're trying to achieve, the level of change, and then ultimately the people you're working with, and whether they're all in-house or whether they're remote, and where they're located geographically. There is no kind of magic bullet, but it's all about people, and get them to understand what's in it for them and why should they care, and you won't go far wrong.
Great, thank you for that. And I'd be interested to hear Martin's perspective on this as well. Martin, do you have a view?
Yeah, I think Mike did a great answer there. I think he covered all the things that were bouncing around in my mind. I just to add a couple of points, I suppose, just to reinforce some of the things that were raised. I think within an organisation, when you embark upon any change, so the digital agenda is no different, really. You need to set down a journey map, and I think that just reinforces Mike's point that if the chairman, the CEO says this is what we're doing and this is where we're going and this is where we want to be at this time, next year, the year after, our 5-year vision, and demonstrating to everybody within an organisation, this is going to happen, and you're either on this journey or you're not. I think is so important as part of that culture that Mike talked about. The other point, and it goes almost back to something that Matt was mentioning, is that because we are in this situation where not everybody is adopting the kind of things we've been talking about today, the costs can be high. But as we start to kind of move further and further along that diagram that I showed in terms of market transformation, the costs will come down. And so it almost becomes, a no-brainer when it comes to trying to adopt these processes. But actually, it will be the thing that differentiates between those companies that really do kind of survive and grow and embrace and find the efficiencies, and those that don't. So I think Mike's spot on in terms of it's about culture, but it's about certainty. We really need to make sure that as you start this journey, you're giving everybody certainty and ownership of what is an agenda that touches most people.
Thanks for that, Martin. So a hearts and minds kind of approach is quite clearly the way forward. Looking at the time, we've got a little bit of time left, so I've got another question, final question for you both, if that's okay. We'll start with Michael on this one. My question is, now PAS 1192 is becoming an international standard, largely driven from the UK, and is more commonly applied to projects. And it's a big question. Hopefully I'm not putting you on the spot too much, but what would you say is the next big digital step change for owner-operator clients? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think,
Mike, if we can get you first.
So from my side, if we look at with the push of 1192, and you've mentioned it's all been driven in projects, ultimately it's also mainly been driven from the supply chain, the consultants and contractors. From my view on what I've seen over the last kind of 5 years, and then from the organisations that I've been talking to, there seems a real drive at the moment that actually asset owners are starting to recognise the importance of this and are grabbing hold of it. And Sainsbury's were kind of one of the first early adopters to really grab hold of this as asset owners and saying, look, actually, we're leading this and we're taking full control. And from the other asset owners I spoke to, I think there's going to be a fundamental shift over the next kind of 5 years, where actually this is getting driven more and more by asset owners defining this is what we need, this is what we want, this is when we want it, and being really clear to enable us to really define and drive our business forward, and that we have the right things in place for whether it's statutory compliance or to inform how we're going to invest our capital in the future. I think the focus will shift more on to being driven by asset owners than it has been previously by consultants, contractors, etc.
Great, thanks for that, Mike. And the same question to you, Martin. Really, have you got a view on what you think might be the next big thing, next big step change?
So you're full of really good questions today, Matt, I have to say. I kind of agree with everything that Mike said, but I'm going to take a slightly different spin, I suppose. The space that I think is growing with great speed is this whole issue about what was an asset designed to achieve and what actually is it achieving. So this whole kind of performance gap, it's often been talked about in terms of energy management. Design team builds me a building, and actually is it now performing as it should do? I don't really know, because the consultants moved on, or the contract was written so that as much time wasn't placed on the energy model at the start of the design process as needed, and therefore I don't have a model that I can calibrate against the actual performance of the building. I think that space in the next couple of years, and you can hold me to that, will change radically. I actually think that forms of contracts will change. The technology that will be inserted into buildings, where an energy model is recalibrated against the actual building that is constructed, and then the client can say, right, you said it was going to achieve this performance. It's been commissioned. It's now kind of fully occupied, and it's not even close to what you said it's going to do. You need now to come back and you need to fix what you said you would be delivered to make sure that actually you're in contract. And I think that space in terms of closing that performance gap, either around energy, or if you look at some of the recommendations from Grenfell and other kind of conversations bouncing around government, will be something which will shape the industry. And I think that's going to be so important in terms of making sure that clients get what they want. Consultants, invest the time at the start of the process to design buildings for performance in a way that can be monitored, and there is a space there in terms of digital technology being inserted in buildings so that it can be monitored effectively, and actually those metrics are understood, and actually that drives real change.
So ultimately, you're seeing it. You envisage a shift really from a delivery of an asset and a walk away to a delivery of an ongoing service, typically.
Yeah, I think, and this is something I'm quite passionate about, is that I honestly believe there is a shift in the market to a service economy. There's some great TED Talks out there about how we've moved from a extraction economy to a product economy to a service economy, now to experience economy. And I think if we're going to make sure that clients are delighted around the way an asset is developed, managed, operated, etc., we really need to kind of adopt some of those principles around service economy. And I think technology will enable that, and actually it will demonstrate the UK can lead the conversation as it has been around kind of the BIM agenda. But actually it presents massive opportunities in terms of how we think about the solutions.
Great, thank you for that. So I think that's looking at the time, we're approaching the end. So I'd like to thank Martin and Mike for joining me today. I think it's been really insightful for me, very useful for me, and it's quite clear we're seeing more informed clients, more subject matter experts, and the next few years I think it's going to be a real interesting shift in the way we operate. So I've flashed up our contact details here. I appreciate everybody joining. Thank you very much. I hope you found this as interesting as I did. I'll leave this up. Feel free to contact us all if you have any additional questions. We'll be posting this recording so you can share with colleagues, and we'll be holding further webinars over the coming months as well, so I hope to see you on those. But as we approach 10:30, I appreciate your time, and everybody have a lovely day, and we'll close this now. So thank you very much for joining, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Thanks all.